What a well-organized thing. Welcome and thank you. Oh, I need to do something here. If I want to walk around, right? It works? Yes, it does. And it's getting late in the day, and we're going to have to stay awake and alert, and I think let's try to make this a little bit interactive, because otherwise you may fall asleep, and I will probably forget some things. Let me start with a little preface about UNDP and about the UNDP Seoul Policy Center. These are the areas of work of UNDP's new strategic plan, this is not our first strategic plan, because we date back to 1966. We are the implementing arm of the UN system, and we work in some 177 countries and territories. And besides having a mandate to do this work that you see up there, we also have the mandate to coordinate the UN system through what is called the resident coordinator system. You may have heard of that. In every country, developing country, there is a resident coordinator, because there are many UN agencies, and many countries that we work in want us to work better together, which of course makes very, very good sense. With scarce resources and many, many issues and a complicated agenda, it's important that we don't duplicate, that we make the best of the resources. Now, we have a budget of some $5 billion every year, and we are entirely voluntarily funded. And less than 15% of our budget is core, which means unearmarked. The rest is earmarked in one way or the other to do specific activities. In 2013, the Republic of Korea was the 11th largest donor to UNDP, providing almost $79 million, and we thank you very much for that. Korea is a growing, what do you call it, a growing donor to UNDP. Now, the Seoul Policy Center is, and we are on the 4th floor, just above here. We are one of 6 global policy centers that UNDP hosts around the world in different countries. We work on different issues, but together I think we sort of cover the ground of UNDP's mandate. The UNDP Seoul Policy Center was established in 2011 to work with Korean international issues and share experience with other countries. We are hosted by Korea University, and we succeeded a country office. Maybe you know that UNDP was very much part of Korea's own development journey, starting from the early 60s, even before we came UNDP. In 2009, when Korea graduated, became a donor member of OECD DAC, and we were closing down because we no longer had a role in Korea, the government said that they wanted us to stay on, but in a different role, which is what we're doing now. And our 3-pillar work program has a focus on the global partnership on development effectiveness. Maybe you recall that in Busan in 2011, there was a big international meeting hosted. The follow-up to that, we work on parts of that agenda, along with the post-2015 development agenda, some issues, and I'm going to focus in on that agenda today. The 2nd pillar is development solutions partnerships, where we work on specific thematic issues with Korean counterparts and through UNDP's network with other countries. Some of the issues we are working on is Samul-Undong, the new village movement. We are going to look into some work on anti-corruption, some green technology and other issues. And the 3rd pillar is outreach, like what I'm doing here today. We are here, of course, also to talk a lot to people. We represent UNDP more broadly than the agenda of the center. And of course, it's important that we interact with many people like you. Now, the first part of my presentation is going to be on a safe and just space for humanity. Now this is a little bit on the understanding of what the challenges are that we are facing, and that the discussions on the post-2015 development agenda, the new agenda, is circling around, trying to grasp hold of. Now, you have heard, of course, of the Millennium Development Goals. Anyone who hasn't, please raise their hands. No? Oh, you haven't? The Millennium Development Goals came out of the Millennium Declaration in 2000. The goals were actually put together by the UN system following the declaration, because we wanted to have something more concrete and not just a declaration. So these 8 goals were put out there, and they have a deadline in 2015 as stated up there. Now, progress has been made, definitely. We're close to meeting the goals on education, health has improved. There are many improvements in these goals, but we still have a long, long way to go. For instance, and now I have to read, because this is these numbers have to be correct. 1.2 billion people still live in extreme poverty. Extreme poverty is less than $1.25 a day. 1 billion people worldwide still practice open defecation. You know what that is? Yes, not very nice. And almost 2.5 billion do not have access to improved sanitation. This is, of course, a major health risk, and it also has implications for the environment. I may touch on that later. 870 million people are going to bed every night hungry, and 1.3 billion people do not have access to electricity. So while we've been going through 15 years, almost 15 years of growth in many parts of the world, this growth has not trickled down like it is often assumed, and we still have the bottom billions, those who basically have not benefited much from developments. Have you heard of the Rio summit in 2012? Yeah. In the run-up to that conference, to prepare and to find out what the issues should be, the UN system did a survey among governments and asked them to spell out which were the important issues to deal with. And they pointed at 11 critical social dimensions: food, water, income, education, resilience, voice, jobs, energy, social equity, and gender equality, and health. And those are the ones you see in the inner circle there, right? Now, these, many of you will recall that you've seen many of these in the context of the MDGs, but there are also additional issues. And the blue field you see in the circle is the gap in meeting these needs and fulfilling human rights. So you see the gaps are quite considerable in some cases. And then, of course, the white space is where we don't have sufficient data to measure. Now, the outer circle, you see there's an outer circle, and that is about the planetary boundaries. You know that we are 7 billion on planet Earth now, and we only have one Earth, even though we talk about Mars and the Moon and other things. We have one planet, and of course, not endless resources. The Stockholm Environment Institute has identified 9 planetary boundaries. Has anyone heard about these before? No? No one has heard about this? Are you all studying social sciences, political science, or someone not in that field of... Okay. So let's just dwell a little bit on these two so that you get an idea of what this is. You will notice that 2 of them are red, right? That's because we have already exceeded our planetary limits. One is biodiversity loss, and the other one is the nitrogen cycle. Does anyone know what that is? Yes? The nitrogen cycle And I was speaking about open defecation before, right? The nitrogen cycle is, and this is not very nice, but this is a fact of life. The nitrogen cycle is about urine. It's about husbandry, animals, and their urine from agriculture that sifts through soil and water and into the oceans. It's also about human urine that is not cleaned when the sewage is not cleaned, and we know that cleaning of sewage for this is rather recent. In my country, for instance, which is Denmark, which is considered fairly developed, we only started cleaning for nitrogen in 1987. So you can imagine that there's a huge issue around the world. What happens when this nitrogen hits the water is that it adds too many nutrients, so algae and other things that we don't want grow, and in the end it suffocates the natural environment. Right, so it's really a bad biodiversity loss. We are losing biodiversity at a rate that we cannot we can hardly count it. Now all the other issues, climate change. You see, we're getting there. Some of the issues up there are not quantified, so we don't have exact numbers. But there are important issues that can hinder development in other areas if they are not dealt with. Now, if you want to, I can talk more about this, but you may come back with some questions. So let's just move to the next slide. This combines the two circles, and you'll see the donut. This one is called the donut. And the green space is the safe and just space for humanity. That's where we can deal without bringing future generations into jeopardy or breaking down the foundation of our societies. This is developed by Kate Raworth. I want to credit an economist from Oxfam. Have you ever heard of Oxfam? Yes, she has developed this. There's some very nice blogs, and you can search on the web and find more about this. Now, if we put the two together, the planetary boundaries and the human rights, you will see that we are overshooting the planetary boundaries and we are undershooting human rights, right? That's not a very good cocktail to start from. However, if we look at some of the issues, it's not really a big deal if there is a will to deal with it. We could end hunger for all by 3% of global food supply. We can supply everyone with electricity by emitting by 1% of the global CO2 emissions. So there are some issues of priority and also of distribution, right? And I'll talk about inequality in a while, but it's clearly related to that. If we look on who puts pressure on the planet, it's the rich or the richer in every part of the world. It used to be in the rich part of the world only. Now we have a much more diverse world. So it's those who put the pressure. Like the 50% of global CO2 emissions are produced by 11% of the world's population. And I was speaking about nitrogen before. You will see that 33% of the global nitrogen budget is used to produce meat for the EU. So we have a clear picture here of inequality and distribution. Now on inequality, we know it's on the stark rise. This is documented. Maybe you have also followed in the media. More and more people speak about this. Even the IMF. They put out a report earlier this year. UNDP put out a report about inequality in January this year. Oxfam put out that study where they found that the richest 85% of people in the world own the same amount of wealth as the bottom half of the world's population. The Gini coefficients, you know what that is? You know what that is, okay. And just to go closer to in the region here, the majority of Asia's population is living in more unequal societies today than they had 2 decades ago. So this growing inequality is everywhere. Now, of course, when you talk about why it is happening, there may be some disagreement, but here are some offerings, some of the underlying causes at least. These ones, we've had a globalization process ongoing, which has weakened those who cannot move around so fast, which is typically labor. You know, you can move production to cheaper places where there's less taxation or less cheaper labor, less environmental standards. You also have governments who are weakened compared to the global corporations, who again can move to other places if they don't find the conditions satisfactory. And one element of this, which is really coming to the forefront now, I think it's something that has been known for many years. I remember when I studied at Copenhagen University, I had a book called Danish Investments in Developing Countries, and it was all about mispricing, how companies mispriced. They could, when they traded internally, they could set the prices so that they would take out the profit into somewhere where the taxation is lower or where there's no taxation. So this is known, but of course with trade growing from 25% of world output in 1960 to now more than 60%, more and more of the world's economy are being put at risk of this malpractice, this potential malpractice. There's a recent there are many studies of this, but a very recent study of this, looking at 5 African countries, Uganda, Ghana, Mozambique, Kenya, and Tanzania, and this is just to illustrate, showed that from 2002 to 2011, they lost, through this mispricing, they lost between 7 and almost 13% of their revenue. And for countries that are wealthier, this may not be so important. In my country, it's also a problem that these companies don't pay tax. They move the whatever around. It's less of a problem because there are more taxpayers, it's more solid economy and so on. But in a poor country, if you lose 13% of your potential revenue every year on that account, it really makes a huge difference. And this is one of the issues that is being discussed now as part of what is called illicit funding, that for the new development agenda we need to look at how these how we can improve the tax systems, improve international cooperation to counter these developments. Now, a second issue is the domestic policies. UNDP's report from January clearly says that the domestically governments have been very aiming at consolidating instead of introducing progressive taxation and also looking at social expenditure. I think that may be changing slightly. Many countries are now looking to social protection because they also see that it really benefits and it brings a lot of strength to the population to have these nets. It's more than a net, but it's a guarantee of certain income at certain times in lives. Now, of course, to deal with this requires governance, global governance, national governance, and I just want you to show you this little Petri dish. You know what this is? Have you ever been to a lab? Yeah? They grow your bacteria, right? If you have a sore throat, they may be grown in a Petri dish. And what happens if there's bacteria and nothing to fight it? The bacteria will grow all over. I show you this because if you remember anything, you remember pictures and you'll remember the Petri dish, right? This is another way of understanding governance, because if we don't do anything, the bacteria will go all over. And governance in the life of the world is a way of making sure that the bacteria stays controlled or at least doesn't spread all over. We know what happens when governance breaks down. The ultimate the ultimate result when outcome when governance breaks down, when our rules and institutions no longer functions, that is war, right? We have seen that before. I think at this continent you have seen a particular side of this, but we go back to 1945, and of course the world was in a very different state coming out of World War II. Second part, the post-2015 development agenda. This is the new agenda coming after the MDGs. Of course, the MDGs will have to be part of that new agenda because, as we saw, they have not been achieved. So there is a lot of unfinished business. So there's no doubt that the MDGs will be very strong in that agenda. Since we've known that this deadline is coming up, and since we also had the Rio process that we just referenced, these processes have come together in a broader kind of thinking than earlier. I was speaking about the safe and just space for humanity. That is a way of approaching a more integrated way of development, where the Millennium Development Goals were more social only. There was not so much economic, they were not so much environmental. Actually, there is an environmental goal, but it's very weak and not very clear. Now, a lot of thoughts have been thought to prepare for this new agenda. Where should we go? What should the focus be? And I'm just listing some of the reports that have been prepared. The first one is done by the UN system, that is all the UN organizations together, to sort of put some ideas, proposals on the table of governments to get their thinking going. Of course, the idea is not that the UN system does this thinking, and we were told at a certain time to step back because government said we can't follow. It's our time that we are in the driver's seat, which they are now. Of course, the Rio outcome document from 2012 was an important part of this. The Secretary General had a high-level panel of eminent persons who looked into sustainable future. The Global Compact, do you know what that is? The UN working with the private sector. You know, the UN has all these standards, we have all these conventions that governments have agreed, we have all these agreements on goals, conventions, and so on, a wide range of things. And in 1999, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, said, we will now offer that medicine to the private sector. So he put together a little package of 9, now it's 10, areas that's derived from the environmental and social and human rights agenda, anti-corruption. And private companies have since then been able to sign up to these and say they will adhere to these principles and they report on it and so on. There's a chapter of this Global Compact in Korea that has, I think, some 500 Korean companies as members. They also did a report. Sustainable Development Solutions Network is an academic network that's led out of Columbia University. They put out a lot of interesting reports. The Secretary General put out a report in September last year, and then there are numerous NGO papers. Now, the SG's report from September last year sort of summarized everything that was in the other reports in a way by saying this agenda has to have 5 headlines. One is eradication of all forms of poverty. You know, poverty is more than income. It's also a question of access to many resources and health and so on. The second is tackling exclusion and inequality. The third is promoting inclusive and sustainable growth. The fourth is building peace and effective governance. The fifth is addressing climate change and other environmental challenges. Now, this is actually not so different than what was in the Millennium Declaration. The difference this time will hopefully be that these issues come together in a better way and are seen as interlinked, and it will be dealt with in a way that's interlinked. In September last year, there was a special event where governments discussed and said what do we do next, right? We've come this far. How do we proceed? How do we get to 2015 where we can agree, hopefully, on a new development agenda? And they agreed that they wanted a single post-2015 framework, meaning that it's not the environmental issues over here and the social, economic over here. It's one single framework. We merge the Rio and the Millennium Declaration. Then there was agreement on the overall issues, and the fourth point there is agreement on that these would be goals for all countries with national variations. You know the Millennium Development Goals, are they for everyone? When I ask like that, they probably aren't. There's goal 7, half of goal 7, and goal 8, which is on partnership and financing. That's also for rich countries. The others are for developing countries, right? It's like for you over there, and then we will help you. The idea of this new agenda is that these goals will be for all. They may not take the same shape in every country because there is a variation. There's a variation of responsibilities and so on. But the idea is to have one agenda for all countries. And of course, that's also a huge challenge. In the UN system, in 2011 already, UNDP started thinking about doing some consultations, not with governments, but with citizens all over the world, hoping to get citizens involved and engaged, for them to discuss with their governments, of course, to engage in this whole discussion about the future we want. And there's a global web platform survey that you can access and answer. The 5 regional consultations were held on this new agenda. 11 initial thematic consultations on inequality, on environmental sustainability, on gender, on many issues, and 6 more have just been launched this spring, and 2 of them are actually going to be financed by Korea. Korea was also a contributor to making the other consultations possible. The 6 new consultations focus on the implementation, what it will take, accountability, civil society, role of private sector, and so on. And then there were 88 national consultations where the UN system, UNDP, and the Department for Economic and Social Affairs worked with the government and stakeholders in countries to go through consultations on how this new agenda should be shaped, what the issues were. And there's a website where you can find more information about all this. Now, in spring last year, an open working group was established under the General Assembly. This is this one comes out of the Rio process. It was mandated, decided in Rio. The mandate is to prepare the Sustainable Development Goals that will take over from the MDGs. It is, in theory, a working group with 30 members. That's what the Rio outcome document said. The interest was so huge that 70 countries, 30 represents 70 countries, so some are together in groups. But in fact, I think all 193 participate. So it's a little bit unclear, but they have had 11 meetings now. And their report is due in September this year before the final negotiations on the post-2015 agenda starts. Now, these are the focus areas that have been discussed over these 11 meetings. And I think it started out as 19. After they had all the discussions, then the co-chairs identified 19. It was reduced to 16, and then when they had the last meeting, 1 more came. And of course, this is probably too many. Most would say we need 10 or 12 goals. So how do you make a selection? How do you actually cut this back to a reasonable number? But these focus areas are potentially the new goals. Of course, they have to be phrased and worded to become goals, but these are the areas. Now, the difficult issues here is, I already mentioned how many goals, right? 10, 12 is probably the maximum. We had 8 MDGs, so a few more will be okay, but it will not be manageable to have more. The question of how many goals is related to a narrative, the text of a report. Instead of saying these are the goals, you can put things into the text. Now, how does that make a difference? It makes a difference because if you put something into a goal, it'll be more visible, it'll get more attention. Everyone will focus in the next 15 years, there will be a review of this and follow-up, data collection. If you put it into the narrative, it will not get the same attention. So one way of getting issues out of attention is, of course, to put them in the narrative. So if governments don't want to have too much attention on some things, they put it in the narrative. And some of the issues that some countries, many developing countries, want to put the rule of law into the narrative because they do not want the world, the global community, to overlook their work. This relates, of course, also to human rights and other issues. There's an issue relating to climate change, because climate change will have, maybe you know that, next year there will be a conference in Paris, a COP, Conference of the Parties, where they have agreed to reach a new agreement on climate change. Now, how do you deal with that when you have one process of governments in one place and you have the goals? Some countries say if we don't put climate change as a goal in the SDGs, we will not get the attention to climate change that we need. And we actually already have a goal. Do you know what goal that is on climate change, agreed in the Climate Change Convention? What is the goal that is agreed? To stay under 2-degree increase, right? And we are not on a good trajectory for that. So that is an unresolved issue. Some things can be put in as cross-cutting. You know, you will have a structure of goals. You have a goal, then you have targets, a certain number of targets under the goal, and then you have a certain number of indicators that you will use to measure progress. And of course, by having good indicators, you can actually get a very good system that you can monitor if you have the data to do it. So the indicators are very important, the targets are also very important, but of course there's a lot of signal value in the goal, like with we've seen with the MDGs. Now, there's also a discussion around what universality means. Developed countries are of the opinion that universality means that all countries have responsibilities. And developed countries do not want to be held accountable without having the resources to achieve, right? So we are back into a very classic discussion about the means of implementation. How will developing countries get the funding for that? And I'll speak to that in a little while when we speak about official development assistance. CBDR, does anyone know what that is? It means common but differentiated responsibilities. This was a principle agreed in Rio in 1992. It refers to some countries being wealthier, having more responsibility for how the world is developing by their actions, and others having less responsibility. I think a very clear example here is climate change, where the African continent emits I don't recall exact, but it's so little of the world's CO2, but they will bear a lot of the impacts from climate change in terms of drought and a changing environment that will make it very difficult to grow the normal crops, for instance. For instance, corn they will not be able to cultivate corn in, I think it's 40% of the African continent when we get to higher temperatures. So there we have an example of something happening which is certainly not Africa's fault. What makes it tricky in this context is that developed countries say the meaning of CBRD is the meaning of Rio in '92. It relates to climate change, global environmental issues, and that's it. The G77 developing countries, on the other hand, say no, this relates to the entire new agenda. Every issue has a common but differentiated responsibility. So we already see that the negotiations, which have not really started, are starting by this positioning. And also with the last point, means of implementation, which is going to be a very critical issue in the discussion. The G77 says we want every goal to have its own means of implementation. You indicate in every goal what the means of implementation will be, and of course they do that because the 0.7 of development assistance was never materialized. Only a few countries have lived up to this, and the MDGs did not have means of implementation attached. But we already see how the discussion is shaping up around these issues, and we also see how the division with the environmental issues and the social issues also go into a divide by some being singled out for a certain discussion. The Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals is part of a wider process. We have many processes ongoing that will all somehow play into this, into the shaping of this new development agenda. We have a particular process also coming out of Rio on sustainable development finance. It's still ongoing. We have a new financing for development conference coming up, also very much related. We have a discussion in the General Assembly on technology facilitation, which is a key issue for developing countries. They say rich countries own all the technology, and for them to prosper they need to have access. Of course that is a tricky issue because it's mostly owned by private companies, so it's not just something you can transfer. We have a high-level political forum. This was a new body that came out of Rio in 2012. It is a hybrid between the General Assembly and the what's called ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, depending on the level it meets. Every 4 years it will meet at the level of heads of state and government, and in between ministerial level. This body is likely to have some kind of monitoring, reporting, reviewing role with the SDGs. That is being discussed now. So there will be some mechanism. I don't know if you know, but there are other international mechanisms where you have regular reviews of how countries are doing. The Human Rights Council, for instance, under the Human Rights Conventions, you have regular reviews and so on. There's always been a lot of resistance towards having that kind of review when you talk about environmental issues, anything that get anywhere near that. So it's not likely that there will be a review mechanism of that kind where governments are obliged to report, but probably some volunteering mechanism, and then slowly the confidence will build and more governments will volunteer to be reviewed. But the modalities are not at all clear yet. Then the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, will present his synthesis report at the end of the year, and he will try to bring everything together to sort of put out a report for governments and say, here it is, and the negotiations will be ongoing already, or they will be about to start. I already mentioned the climate change COP21 in 2015. It's going to be very interesting to see where that is going. And the final one, maybe you don't see it very well, is the outcome of the high-level meeting on the global partnership in Mexico, which may also be included, although it's not a UN process. This was the follow-up meeting to the meeting in Busan in 2011 I was talking about. And I'll just turn to that now, because the third part and last part of the presentation is on implementation, or the how. How will it be done, right? I think the first part was what. The second was a lot about process, but also about what. And then there is the whole issue, how will it, once we have an agenda, how will it be implemented? Now, we have the unfinished business of official development assistance. You know, there's a goal from adopted in the General Assembly in the 70s that all developed countries should give 0.7% of their gross national income as ODA. And you will see there's a green line going down. You'll see very few countries actually live up to that, even though many years have passed. And of course, this is a very thorny issue for developing countries, although the world has changed a lot since that goal was adopted. Of course, we have a world now where the developing countries is a very, very wide and homogeneous concept. Some have become high-income countries, they've become middle-income countries. It's a different story than the story of the 70s. Still, this issue is very important. Now, in 2013, development assistance actually reached its highest level ever. OECD DAC is the one pulling these numbers together, and it rose by 6.1% in 2013. But it still doesn't go above the 0.26% of the global GNI. So in that sense, nothing is really moving. And there were also concerns expressed when these numbers came out, because, and one of them was Helen Clark, the administrator of UNDP, who said that there are certain expenses that governments use ODA to pay for that are maybe not really worthy of ODA financing. So there is an issue there. I just want to show you the multilateral share or the bilateral share of this ODA. You will see the blue-purple at the bottom is the bilateral, which is growing. The multilateral, which is the one the whole UN system, the World Bank, multilateral development banks, and so on are financed by, is more or less stable. We don't have a growing budget or role, but we are staying more or less at the level. The questions, of course, is what role development cooperation will play in the post-2015 development agenda. I already mentioned that countries are graduating, they're becoming middle-income countries or high-income countries, and you may know that this is a classification coming from the World Bank, and when countries pass these thresholds by gross national income per capita, they graduate from the system, and there are certain kinds of ODA assistance that they are no longer entitled to receive. So in theory, with more countries graduating, there would be, and we see that the overall budget is increasing, in theory there would be more money for the poorest countries, right? That's quite logical. But that's not the case. Actually, in 2013, the share of the low-income countries or the least developed countries, notably in Africa, went down. So they are getting less. More money is going to middle-income countries, maybe because donors also see a relation with trade. The whole thinking around all this is changing, and some donor countries have actually merged their development cooperation with their trade in foreign ministries. So the landscape is altering in many ways. Now, there are questions: where and how can ODA have the greatest impact in leveraging other sources of development financing? I mentioned the tax issues earlier, and one of the things that is being discussed now more than ever is how ODA can be used to leverage and be a catalytic force in building countries' own tax systems and building an international system that can maybe make sure, I don't know, you know, in the G20 have agreed that there will be exchange of tax information and so on. So ODA can play a very important role in that regard, in addition to, of course, in the poorest countries, going directly to the financing of health or other health costs or other needs. Then, who are the donors of today, and do they play by the same rules? Now, I think Korea was the last country, or there may be one more, to join OECD DAC in 2009. But we have more donors out there because these countries who are becoming richer and they want to work with other countries, they want to share. So many countries actually have development cooperation now. UNDP is working with many of them to help them set up their domestic systems, of course also because we would like them to abide by certain rules and norms, because otherwise there's no way we can know whether it's actually development assistance. But some of these countries may join OECD, and there are countries who have applied. There are more and more countries joining OECD, but they may not join OECD DAC because that is seen as the rich, a little bit as the rich club. At least some are withholding on that. So they don't probably today play by the same rules, but the discussions are ongoing, and not least in the context of the Global Partnership on Development Cooperation Effectiveness, which I have spoken about a few times before. One of the discussions there, and you will see that from this agenda from the Mexico meeting in April, these are the 5 headlines of the meeting and of the communique. And you will see the issues that I've been discussing today repeated there. Progress since Busan, which is progress on the principles. These principles came out of a meeting in OECD in Paris in 2005, and they're all about country ownership, the country being in the recipient country being in the driver's seat of what happens, not donors putting aid in, but the government taking charge. Donors using country systems to deliver because we want to build capacity. We don't want to build parallel structures that duplicate and which don't leave anything behind once the money is gone or is spent. So this whole agenda makes very good sense to get more out of development assistance and to help build capacity in the countries that need it. So one item, of course, is: has progress been made? It's not that there isn't that much progress because donors do find it difficult to use country systems, and that's of course taxpayer money going into maybe budget allocations and no accounting and so on. So there are many issues and discussion around that, but it's important to keep following that that agenda. Then the second item was the partnering for effective taxation and domestic resource mobilization. I've touched upon this several times. The third is South Triangular cooperation and knowledge sharing, and that relates to all the new donors and the new relationships. And this is a very It's an issue that keeps coming up, many meetings and many discussions in many contexts. In a few weeks, UNDP and Turkey will be co-hosting a conference in Istanbul that zooms in on exactly this issue. Then there's the question of development cooperation with the middle-income countries. How is that different from working with the low-income countries? And the final issue is business as a partner in development. Public-private partnerships, you've heard about all these agendas. How do business become responsible partners in development? In addition, there were 37 voluntary initiatives launched by governments in Mexico, and one of these initiatives was launched by Korea. It's a training, helping to train governments working on the Busan principles and on the implementation. And this training will take place in Korea in autumn, back to back with an implementation meeting that was mentioned in the outcome document and welcomed with appreciation, which is Korea hosting an annual meeting, an annual workshop where we take stock of where implementation progress since Busan is. Where are we in terms of implementation? And my center, the UNDP Seoul Policy Center, will be working with the Korean government on the preparation of these meetings. Now, almost my final slide. This is a quote from the Global Partnership for Effective Development Cooperation, again, the Busan, Mexico, where the countries who were present in Mexico, and this is not all countries, expressed the wish to see the global partnership become part of the how of the implementation of the post-2015 agenda. But since some 30 countries are missing from the Busan, Mexico discussions, and the post-2015, of course, is a General Assembly with 193 countries, we still don't know how this will shape up. But of course, a lot of work has been done under the Global Partnership, and they will continue with the meetings I just spoke about hosted in Korea within the next half a year. And before then, before autumn, we will of course have the report of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development goals. That will be very interesting to see. There will be more discussions on the role for the high-level political forum on the monitoring, reporting, reviewing of that new agenda. And it'll be decided when the actual negotiations, when governments will go into real negotiation mode, right? This month in the Open Working Group, later this month, there will be some negotiations starting on targets, but it's not the full-fledged, right? We're still, and there's been an attempt to hold a bit back on this, not go into the negotiation mode too early, because then it will go on. Usually we say that governments take as much time as they have to arrive at a result. Now, in 2015, everything will have to come together, and hopefully in a very ambitious post-2015 development agenda with a set of SDGs, targets, indicators, a plan for reviewing progress, a narrative, and so on. And internally in the UN system, we are also discussing how we can adapt to this new agenda by becoming more fit for purpose, and that is actually also about better integration, delivering as one at the country level, which is a voluntary way for the UN to work together in countries, but 36 countries have now asked us to work with one leader, one plan, one budget, one program, and become one organization at the country level, even though we are many organizations that have been set up in different contexts. To conclude, this is not an easy journey to arrive at this post-2015 development agenda. I think it's one that concerns all of us. It's really important for everyone in this room, for everyone out there. But the journey to get there and also the journey to implement it is going to be very long. It took years before the MDGs had actually been, there was an uptake and an understanding of them. Maybe it will be easier this time, but still it will take a while. The final remark is, my final remark is an African proverb that says, if you want to travel fast, travel alone. And if you want to travel far, travel together. Thank you.